Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. Let us extend a warm welcome to Auden Schendler as he joins us on our podcast. Auden is the Senior Vice President of Sustainability at Aspen Skiing Company, leading initiatives in clean energy, policy advocacy, and climate activism. He spearheaded the only coal-mine-methane-to-electricity project in the US and serves on the board of Protect Our Winters, mobilizing the outdoor industry as a political force. A former Rocky Mountain Institute research associate, Auden authored Getting Green Done and has been featured in major outlets like Businessweek and Fast Company. Named a climate innovator by Time magazine and a climate saver by the EPA. He has testified before Congress and spoken at institutions like Harvard, MIT, and Google. In this episode, Auden Schendler will share profound insights from his book, Terrible Beauty, Reckoning with Climate Complicity and Rediscovering Our Soul. Auden, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. Auden, you argued in your book that modern environmentalism has become a big green lie. Can you elaborate on what you mean by this and how it reflects the broader issues with corporate sustainability efforts and individual actions?
Sure. So we live in a society that is driven by fossil fuels. And the main threat to sustainability is climate change. In order to deal with the carbon problem, we need to get off fossil fuels. And that requires systemic change. It's an economic revolution. It's a little bit of a social revolution. The problem is that modern environmentalism, for the most part, not all of it, but most of it, takes token actions at the individual or the firm level that won't ever change that broad fossil fuel economy. And so my concern is that environmentalism as practiced, particularly in the United States, but also globally, intentionally, to some extent, misses the point. And so I've argued that it's complicit with the status quo. Now, the things that would be different, the things we need to do differently are the kinds of things that change whole systems. So that's policy, it's social movements, it's corporations wielding the power they can use to drive bigger systems change.
You discuss the disconnect between our environmental aspirations and the actions we take in everyday life. Why do you think so many people, businesses, and governments continue to engage in what you call climate complicity, even with the threat of climate change looming?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the things that are required to actually solve the climate problem, they're actually quite difficult and unpleasant. And so if a CEO of a corporation tomorrow wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and said, we need federal policy action throughout the world, government policy action on climate, that person would get horribly criticized, not just by peers in the industry, but by friends in his or her community. So one of the reasons we haven't taken action is that these are difficult tasks that are controversial. But another reason is that in the short term, corporations and business profit from a fossil fuel status quo, and business isn't looking out over the long term. And then a last point is that globally, really, but I focus especially on the United States, we have this incredible emphasis on what is called free market economics. It's neoliberalism. And the problem with that is it's essentially anti-regulation, and regulation of certain things, like, for example, pollution, are essential even in a kind of free-ish market economy.
In your book, you mentioned that the modern environmental roadmap could have been written by the fossil fuel industry. How has the fossil fuel industry shaped or manipulated the sustainability practices that are widely accepted today?
Sorry, can you repeat that? How has the fossil fuel industry shaped those practices?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, okay. So I think if you look at, if you said, if the fossil fuel industry wanted to create a suite of, quote, environmental actions that the business community would take that wouldn't get in their way, it would look like modern corporate sustainability. So those things would be, we're going to we're going to take responsibility for our carbon footprint. And remember, the carbon footprint wasn't created. The corporations didn't ask for a fossil fuel economy. They asked for an affordable energy economy. And so then the suite of actions that business would be asked to take would be set carbon targets, as I just said, take responsibility for the problem, address only your own operational issues, but not broader governmental or societal issues. Um, buy carbon offsets, which also don't go in the way of the fossil fuel industry. So the whole suite of things could have been designed by the fossil fuel industry.
Oden, the book touches on the tension between individual efforts to reduce carbon footprints and the overarching global systems that perpetuate climate damage. How do we reconcile our individual actions with the systematic changes needed to address climate change?
Yeah, one of the points of this book, and this is what makes the book different from any other business or climate book, and this is an important point because I'm not really interested in those books anymore. I find that I've read them all and they're very similar. I'm trying to get people to recognize that there's a gap between the things they care about, which is family, community, the natural world, and the actions they're taking on climate. And I'm trying to use people's individual love of their lives and the world and their families as a booster to get them to care and act at scale on climate change.
You speak about the moral and spiritual aspects of the addressing climate change. However, conscience tell us we have been obligations to repair the world. And how can we reframe environmentalism not just as a technical issue, but also as a deeply spiritual and ethical endeavor?
Yeah, a big effort in the book is to point out that human beings all over the world spent thousands of years trying to figure out how they should live their lives. That's sort of the basic instinct of all religion. Globally, religions are the foundation of a framework for living a good life, a moral life, and also a life that works well in society. And we've really deviated from those principles, certainly in the United States, but also globally. So, a hopeful part of the book is to say, look, all we're saying is that we've said we care about each other. We would like to treat others well. We want to live a meaningful existence. It's all there, it's all written. We've already talked about it. Let's actually do it. And climate change presents this unprecedented opportunity to realize some of those aspirations we've had throughout history and throughout civilization's history.
Given that the current systems are built around maintaining the status quo, what bold steps or radical shifts do you believe are necessary to truly address the civilization threat or climate change?
Yeah, so I do think we need to take much more radical action. And uh, the really what I'm arguing for is a form of revolution or social movement, and that happens constantly throughout society. It's not scary. It doesn't have to be violent. Um, but I do think in order for that to happen, people need to mobilize beyond their own individual or firm level actions. And so that means thinking, you know, how do things change in society? And the answer is that large but not overwhelming numbers of people get together as civic actors. And so an example of that is to say, in my industry, which is the outdoor industry, how come we haven't gotten that large group of people, which is 40 million strong globally? It's much, much larger, to use their voice to push for action on climate. So we need a large social movement that we haven't had really in the environmental movement at all previously.
In your experience, how do we move from awareness to climate change to meaningful actions that disrupt the systems causing the problem, particularly in a world where superficial sustainability efforts are so prevalent?
Yeah, how do we get to that meaningful action? I think we need to rethink how change happens and what our roles are as citizens of nations. And um, as we've discussed already here, we have to move past the sense that fixing ourselves or fixing our firm is enough and use government for what it was built for. There's this again, I'm speaking from the United States, but there's a global implication here. We've sort of lost faith in government's role in society to some extent, but government does have an important role in society, and it's capable of fixing large problems like this, and we've done it in the past. Think about pandemics, or think about the chlorofluorocarbon problem that was solved with a global treaty. So we can do this. We've just lost faith in government's ability to do that. But government is our tool, it's the people's tool. So we have the capacity to do this.
For those who feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem and unsure where to start, what advice do you have on how to take impactful steps, both on a personal and collective level?
Yeah, so part of this book is about the truth that trying to solve climate change is borderline impossible. We're actually not going to solve it. We've warmed a bunch already. We'll warm a little more. And so what I talk about in the second half of the book is the notion of trying to tackle this as a practice, a way of living your life versus a win-lose battle. And you can think of it as you wake up, you work on the climate problem a little bit after drinking tea or coffee, and then you do that again the next day. And it's a very gratifying thing to be engaged in such a meaningful and important pursuit. But if you think about it as win-lose, you're going to get very discouraged.
Auden, my last question. What do you envision for the future of environmentalism?
Yeah, I think the future of environmentalism is going to be movement based. It's going to look back into the history of social change and revolution and tap some of those tools. There are people already doing this, whether it's Greta Thunberg or Roger Hallam at Extinction Rebellion, and even more mainstream groups that Bill McKibben's involved with, and so forth. So the future is to say, we're not going to accept tokenism as a meaningful solution. We're going to actually try to solve these problems. It's going to require significant change, but you're beginning to see that sort of change throughout the world. In India, for example, the amount of renewable energy, wind and solar being produced every year is astonishing. There is a big focus on this in China as well. The United States is making enormous progress on electric vehicles and many other things. So it's this broad societal based effort that says all your individual and operational changes are good and important, but now we need to think bigger.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode with Auden Schendler, where he shared invaluable insights from his book, Terrible Beauty, Reckoning with Climate Complicity and Discovering Our Soul. Auden, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for your invaluable contributions.